Hello, welcome to part 2 of this Science Section 1 series of videos. You should have watched part 1, and part 1 was about the definition of ecology, and we left off on climate. Now we're going to talk about other abiotic factors. One is soil. Okay, soil isn't particularly important for us as humans, but it's important to plants, and plants are important to us. Okay, as you know, soil is the medium for plant growth, so we need soil so that plants can grow. What they need, maybe wondering, why do they need soil? Soil facilitates respiration, it moderates the temperature of the plants, it provides water and nutrients, and then it protects the plants from toxins. Okay, it's kind of like a filter so that they don't get all the bad stuff. Okay, so soil forms the environmental basis for most land ecosystems. So how your environment is determined for land ecosystems really heavily depends on soil. Okay, so let's look at soil formation, like how is soil formed? Okay, soil is formed by the weathering and breaking down of parent material through these processes. So parent material, you may have heard of parent material as underlying rock or mineral. So way at the beginning of time, everything was kind of like a rock or a big mineral substrate, and just over years it gets broken down and broken down and broken down, and we get soil. Okay, it could be broken down mechanically. So it could be through like freezing and thawing or wet and dry cycles. So you could break down parent material just mechanically. It can also be broken down chemically. So you may have heard of things like acid rain, or it can be broken down by water, oxygen. So chemically, you could break down parent material. Or it can be done by what they call decomposition. So once it starts to break down, different animals can break down the parent material into organic compounds, and it adds nutrients to the soil. Okay, these are very, 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 very slow processes. So it takes thousands of years to develop a complex organic soil that can support diverse, organisms or plants, and then those plants can do animals. So there's a strong appreciation for soil because it takes thousands of years to create. It's not as easy as you think it can be. Just like we had to define different types of the hierarchy for ecosystems, you also need to know the definition of the levels of soil. Okay, I know it's weird because it's not in alphabetical order, but let me tell you about what it is. So we start at the top. This is what they go O to R. Okay, O meaning the top layer, like that what you actually see, and R meaning the bottom layer. O, it stands for organic material. Okay, it is everything that's basically just falls on top. So we're talking about leaves, we're talking about grass, we're talking about just anything that falls on top of the soil. Okay, trash, anything that's on top, they call that O, the O layer, the O horizon. Sorry, O horizon, organic material. The A horizon is called topsoil. So it is the first layer of soil, in soil, in the ground, the first layer of soil in the ground. That's called A horizon. Okay, underneath that, they call that the subsoil, called the B horizon. It has limited organic matter, and it has mineral particles. So think about it this way: at the bottom, we have our parent material, and our mineral particles are all at the bottom. And eventually, as it gets broken down, so at the top, like it's nice and soft and things that plants can use. Okay, the C horizon is called the parent material. So that is what they call the big stuff that can't be used as soil. Plants can't use it. It's called the parent material. And then again, so it goes O for organic, then A, B, C, which I think you guys can memorize. And then R is at the bottom. R is called the bedrock, so maybe R for rock. And then every time I teach this, everybody always laughs about bedrock, but hey, you guys are more mature than that, right? The next thing we talked about was water. Water is also an important abiotic factor, so we talked about soil. Water is just as important in terms of a factor for ecology. Okay. Now, the availability of amount of water that flows through an ecosystem is determined by its biodiversity. So we have, in terms of how water comes to an ecosystem, it could be from evaporation and transpiration, evapotranspiration. It could be runoff from another ecosystem, or again, precipitation from rain or snow. So now, light. Light is life. Life is it's important to ecosystem productivity. So we talked about climate, we've talked about soil, we talked about water. This one's about light. Sunlight is important because it drives photosynthesis. That plants basically take in sunlight and carbon dioxide to create oxygen, and also plants create cellulose so they could live. They create sugars. Okay. Light availability is determined by the biome type. So say, for example, this forest. So the light availability is not as strong or not as much, determined by altitude and also depending on the season. Okay. And this is very, very, very important because it drives photosynthesis. And if there's no photosynthesis, then your ecosystem cannot be productive. Okay. Now, we can have some ecosystem, the light availability varies by ecosystem and seasonal changes. Okay, so in terms of the ecosystem variation, most photosynthesizing organisms reside near the top layer in aquatic ecosystems, and then dense forests develop these thick canopies that deprive the ground plants of light. So just giving you examples of ecosystems and how they vary in terms of light availability. So for aquatic ecosystems, for the oceans, for the waters, most of the photosynthetic organisms have to be at the top, because if they're at the bottom of the ocean, they're not going to get any light. Same thing with these dense forests. Dense forests have these thick canopies, and the ground plants really don't get much light. Okay. In terms of seasonal variation, if you have deciduous trees, they shed their leaves in response to winter. So in a typical, not necessarily Southern California, but places that have seasons, the reason why they drop their leaves is because there's decreased sunlight in the winter. Okay. Then there's this video. It's about photosynthesis. I don't want to play it for you. It's very kiddish, but just know that every plant does photosynthesis. You should have learned it already. And then a funny thing, even I need light to photosynthesize. Ha. All right. Another abiotic factor, just moving down the line, is wind. Wind is important because it erodes and has drying effects on an ecosystem. And it really affects like how plants are and the adaptations of a plant. Okay, so if you have a lot of wind, it might determine if it has, an adaptation to wind, maybe flexible stems, succulent tissues, narrow leaves. Plants in areas that are prone to high winds have these adaptations. Okay, so for example, one example I like to give is, since we're out here in LA, you may have, or even if you've been to Hawaii, you know about palm trees. So the way that palm trees are, and the reason why they're here, is because they are very flexible. They can sustain a whole bunch of wind and still be standing. So that's an adaptation. That's why there's so many palm trees in LA and Hawaii. The next abiotic factor we'll talk about is salinity. Salinity, sodium, salty. So we're talking about how much dissolved salt is in a water. So something that's very high in salinity versus something very low in salinity is basically saying how salty is the water. Okay. The Earth's oceans and their adjacent soils have very high salinity. So we're talking about 33 to 37 parts per thousand. Okay. Organisms that live in high salinity ecosystems, again, since we're talking about relationships between abiotic and biotic, or abiotic and biotic components, some of these biotic, or some of these organisms, have special adaptations. So just like we said, plants have special adaptations when it's very windy. These animals down below, these organisms, have special adaptations depending on how salty the water is. So for example, things that are, some of these plants have roots that don't take in salt. So that's kind of like an adaptation that over years, now we have these plants that just don't take in salt through its roots. We have animals that move with the tide. So depending on the tide, it maintains the salinity. So some of our organisms, saltwater organisms, need that salt. So they move and they fluctuate and they migrate depending on the tide, so that the salinity is the same. Some excrete salt through their gills and glands to make up for all that high saltiness. Some of these, like this fish, can drink the salt water and then excess the salts right away. And then some animals, they have fresh water, or they need the fresh water. They get it from food, so they don't get so much salt. Okay. So now from all those abiotic factors, we're going to move into biomes. Maybe I'll stop here and I'll start the next video. So I hope you enjoyed all those discussions about abiotic factors, and I'll see y'all next time.